This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. Welcome to today's Critical Thought. As always, before we get going, thank you to currently 969 subscribers here on the YouTube channel. If you're a first timer and you're enjoying the content, be sure to like and subscribe as we make our way up to 1,000. As I said last week, I did order Bloodborne. It seems to be somewhere lost right now, but hopefully I'll be able to play it maybe tomorrow, or who knows when it gets here after the whole Black Friday, Cyber Monday madness. But for today's Critical Thought, we're back to talking about UI design. And for today's topic, we're focusing on integrated UIs. When we last talked about GUI design, which for this topic and for the later ones, we'll just refer to it as UI design, just to make it a little bit easier. When we talked about it, I mentioned that a good UI is a combination of design, programming, and art. And art is the key phrase for today. When we're talking about an integrated UI, what we mean is that instead of having static elements on the screen, info panels, stuff like that, the UI is built directly into the game space. This has the impact of making it not only a lot easier to read at a moment's notice, but it makes the screen very clean because you're not having different elements distracting the player and blocking information and such. When it comes to an integrated UI, it's not so much a black or white, yes or no kind of deal, but it's more about different degrees of its integration. At its lowest level, we can simply use like custom UI elements, or even having like the character change to represent like damage or upgrades. There's some classic examples like in Ghouls and Ghosts, or Ghosts and Goblins. I always get the two confused, where your armor shows you how much health you have. When you're wearing a suit of armor, you have 2 points of health. When you're down to Arthur's boxer shorts, you have 1. In classic Metroid games like Super Metroid, as Samus gets new abilities and gets new suits, her suit color changes, stuff like that. Again, at this level, it's very basic stuff. As we move up, the UI elements become more integrated into the game space, or even into the camera itself. And a major example of this would be what we see in modern third and first person shooters, where instead of having a dedicated health bar, and that it may like regenerate, it'll go down here and then will slowly come back out again, instead the screen itself represents your health. As you take damage, you'll see like blood splotches, the color may drain, stuff like that, and then when your health recharges, it goes back to normal. Also, somebody remind me, we need to have a critical thought on regenerating health systems, because that's actually a really good topic about how things have changed over the last decade. But, getting back to it, a sort of side example or a tangent of an integrated UI will be what we sometimes see in shooters, where information will only be on the screen when it's currently being used or relevant. In Uncharted, for instance, when you're not shooting your gun or in combat, the display or the UI for your gun, ammo, grenades, stuff like that, disappears off screen. And then when you're actually fighting, they appear to let you know. Now, the reason why this isn't a full example of an integrated UI is because you're still dealing with these static GUI or UI elements. But it is a smarter way of showing them and keeping the screen clear when you don't need them. Now, at its highest level, we see just how useful or just how much of an impact an integrated UI can have, and also where it gets very tricky to design. At the kind of bottom of the top, if that makes sense to you, we have games such as Fallout 3 and 4 and Borderlands, who feature an actual in-game lore or in-game device that represents the UI. When you're playing Fallout, for instance, instead of going to a static or a generic menu, your character, lifts up his wrist and the Pip-Boy shows all the information as to what you have, what your current stats are, stuff like that. Borderlands does that as well with its device. And like instead of going to an inventory, when you hit the button, the hologram pops up that lets you see everything. Now, when we go even further still, it becomes even more interesting. And the two examples that I have would be Dead Space and Ghostbusters, the video game. We'll start with Ghostbusters. In the game, your proton pack that you wear is your UI. There are no other elements on screen to show you what your health is or stuff like that. What they do is that the different readings that you see on the side and back of the proton pack represent the UI. So you have a green bar that represents your health. You have another bar that represents how much ammo or the heat your gun is generating, and then you have to cool it off. And then the back itself will actually transform depending upon what specific weapon type you're using. So you're using the normal proton pack, it looks one way. You're using the slime tether, it looks another way, etc. And then we can see this even further with Dead Space, who literally just combines every element of its UI into the player's suit. And there are no outside UI menus either. What they do, which is very clever, is again, the back of your suit represents your health. There's a green bar that runs along the length of your spine that shows how much health you have. And then to the side of that, there's another mark that shows how much of the game's it's like special energy that you use. And then every weapon in the game has its own unique holographic display. So when you're aiming with the gun, you pull up, you get the holographic reticle and a reading of your weapon. Speaking of which, first-person shooters who also use like a actual ammo counter on the gun would be a smaller example of an integrated UI. I just wanted to get that out there before I forget. And then in Dead Space, what they do is, again, instead of going to a generic menu, when you hit pause, he lifts up his wrist and you get the holographic UI on the screen again. Instead of having a generic quest marker, you press a button, he holds out his hand, and you get the hologram or the AR display on the floor that shows you where you can go next or where you need to go. And again, this doesn't sound all that amazing, but what they do essentially is they don't need any UI elements on the screen. It's all on the player, and it gives a very cinematic and a very clean look to your title. Now, with that said, let's talk about some of the cons and sort of the challenges of an integrated UI. The first one is that it really doesn't work for every genre or every game. Integrated UIs are the best when you're trying to pull the player into the world, whether if you're playing as a character that's supposed to be you, or if it's in a first-person setting where you're essentially looking through the screen. If we're playing a game like a platformer, or a strategy game, or a simulation, it becomes a little bit harder. Now, before anyone says it, the sim genre is also another interesting part of an integrated UI, and actually it leads me to a question I want to ask you folks. As you know, many sim games base their UIs off of the real-world displays. When you're playing a flight simulator, you're not getting, UIs and window panes as you would in a normal video game. Instead, you're getting the literal cockpit with all the buttons, gauges, and stuff like that. My question for you is, do you consider that to be an integrated UI? Technically, it's not really a UI because you're just using the real-world options or the real-world mechanisms. But it is still integrated into the game, and there are no outside menus or interfaces to use. Now, the difficulty of when we talk about like 2D games or games that you're not really playing yourself in a sense, an integrated UI just doesn't really work. And more importantly, it can become harder to get the information that you need. Games like Stellaris, Europa Universalis, Civilization, any kind of strategy game that requires you to understand multiple sources of data at a single point, it's not really feasible to directly integrate those elements in because you want them to be in your face. For instance, I can't imagine an integrated UI for the government menu for Civilization, or religion, the tech tree, etc. The other challenge of an integrated UI, and what also adds to it, is that because the UI is built directly into the game space, you need to make sure that it is always visible to the player. They need to know what their health is or what their ammo is at any time. You don't want, explosions on the screen or the camera shaking to block those or restrict that viewing. This is why for games where the camera may be moving around a lot, or it may be hard to keep focus on things, that you use a more static UI. In the Souls series, for instance, the UI is essentially layered on top of the game space. So you have, like, right here, you have your weapons, your whatever your items are, and then up here you have your actual health, magic, stamina, etc. And those elements, again, are layered. So no matter what's happening on the screen, no matter where the camera is pointing, no matter how much the player is doing, those elements there, if I can if I can get my hands pointed right, here and here, there we go, will always be on the screen, will always be visible. Now, when you're playing a game like Dead Space, because the camera is always being shown from Isaac's back when you're fighting or when you're trying to do anything, that's how they basically get around that problem. But again, if you're playing a game where things are constantly in motion, where your character is constantly turning around, doing rolls and jumps and all that, it becomes that much harder to get the integrated UI to work. And again, when it comes to a strategy game, or a game where you're kind of the out-of-body observer, it becomes a little bit harder. Now, with that said, I'm sure someone is getting ready to put in the comments about games that kind of feature a custom UI, such as in StarCraft, where each race gets their own, UI pane, like down here. It's yes and no an example. Again, it is a custom UI, but it's still kind of existing outside the game space. And info panes and windows like that, that is definitely another topic we can talk about with UI design later on. But we'll wrap up today's critical thought here within like the next minute. Again, integrated UIs aren't going to turn a bad game into an amazing game. They're definitely more on the extravagance, I guess, feature when it comes to designing a title. And again, you want to focus on making a great game first and foremost. But they can definitely act as the icing on the cake or the ribbon on the gift, stuff like that, to elevate a game. And if you can get it to work, it can make your game pop that much more. And also, it can have the side effect of solving issues of having your screen cluttered with UI elements. If you can figure out a way to show that stuff very cleanly and within the game space, you can free up that space so that people can look at more of the game and ooh and ah and stuff like that. And again, it helps to make your game look very clean. But again, not every game can fit it in. And of course, there's the challenge of the lore of the game itself. Obviously, in like real world settings, we don't have holographic displays from our hands or our very own Pip-Boy. Now, of course, some series like Tom Clancy that deal with future tech will sometimes pop up the holographic display and try to rationalize that in the world. But typically, like fantasy, sci-fi, stuff like that, will make use of integrated UIs at the far end of the scale. But as we talked about, there are definitely little tricks and little things you can do to your game to have examples of an integrated UI. The regenerating health is a good example. Having your ammo display on the gun itself is another one. And again, I'm sure there are plenty more tricks and little tips out there. And if you have any that you would like to suggest, leave them in the comments below. But otherwise, we're going to end things here. Once again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed things, be sure to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. Check back tomorrow for more great content here, as well as on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. For tonight's stream, I think I'm going to do some of Let It Die, the free-to-play roguelike from Grasshopper Manufacture. So be sure to check that out on the Twitch channel, Josh Bycer. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Once again, I'm Josh Bycer. Have a great night, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Take care. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GW Bycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.